Good evening. There is a lot to talk about tonight. Obviously, Odessa is suffering under the fourth night of attacks now. Since the cancellation of the Black Sea grain deal, which has seen, well, actually, I should say not the cancellation, since the ending of the Black Sea grain deal. Just to be clear on this point, Russia hasn't cancelled this deal. The original deal was started last year, in March of last year, and was planned to run for 120 days. I think it took through till November of 2022. And then Russia extended the deal a number of times. So it hasn't been, as many people have said, that Russia have cancelled and pulled out of the deal. They have actually technically decided not to extend the deal further after having extended the original deal a number of times. So with that deal coming to an end, Russia has enacted heavy missile and drone strikes upon the port of Odessa, other surrounding ports in the area as well have been attacked, and this seems to be to thwart any attempts of Ukraine possibly attempting to continue to traffic goods through the port of Odessa. Even without without Russia agreeing to extend the deal. There was some talk that some requests and suggestions from Ukraine that the US forces or Turkish forces might choose to accompany grain ships into the ports of Odessa, in defiance of the Russian blockade, which will be put in place there now. Now, both Turkey and the US have declined to undertake that, with them clearly not wanting to get into a naval battle in the Black Sea with Russia. The Turkish fleet is a substantial fleet. They do have a number of craft in the Turkish fleet, quite a few. However, they have far fewer submarines than the Russian fleet does. So Turkey's navy is currently effectively safely out of this conflict, and I think that President Erdogan would like to keep it that way. So the attacks on Odessa have been interesting in the way that they have been deployed. The approach seems, or the tactic seems to have been to send out some Geranium drones, Geran drones, Russian for Geranium, or Shahed drones. The Shahed version are the Iranian version of these drones. The Geran are then the ones which the Russians have taken and designed and are producing themselves. So it seems some Gerans have been sent out to reveal air defences around Odessa and surrounding ports. This has then allowed for the use of supersonic missiles, things like the P-800 Onyx and Kalibrs and KH-22 missiles. These are impressive pieces of military equipment to then, once air defence has been identified and located, to go and destroy those, which then enables another group of drones to then be sent, and those drones can then achieve their targets unencumbered by the air defence around the port. Some of these missiles, the P-800 Onyx, for example, can achieve speeds of Mach 2.6, which is really quite phenomenal. It's travelling at that stage at a speed of 884 meters per second, or in the old school, about half a mile a second. It's very, very fast. The Kh-22 missiles, so the Onyx can travel at Mach 2.6. The Kh-22 can travel at Mach 4.6 and carry a 1,000 kilogram warhead. Now, 1,000 kilograms of explosive warhead will do major damage to whatever it is targeted at. Some of these missiles too are incredibly accurate, using the Glasnost GPS, or the Russian GPS equivalent. They're able to hit targets within a range of 2 to 3 meters of accuracy. So if you've got 1,000 kilograms of explosive on board, that's accurate enough to be considered a pinpoint strike, really. Some of the things that have been reported as being destroyed in Odessa, so administrative buildings, grain silos, oil and lubricant depots, docking cranes, also the Nikolaev port. There apparently around that area, an S-300 air defense system has been destroyed, as well as Gepard, a Flakpanzer, German supplied self-propelled air defense system has been destroyed. And there are also attacks on the Shkolny Airfield in Odessa, which has allegedly been used for launching drones. And there has been a strike has been made there. Some other things in the area that have been hit: a bridge across the Dniester in Mayaki, a bridge across the Dniester estuary in Zatoka, and fuel storage facilities. With these attacks on Odessa happening, Russia has now, and according to the mayor of Odessa, this damage that has been done on the port will take a year to repair. So Russia has effectively neutralized Ukraine's ability to use the ports to ship products, to generate revenue, and as has appeared in a number of reports, has stopped the ability for what Russia has believed has been happening, which is the import of weapons in returning grain ships. Now, I can't corroborate that, but that has appeared in reporting relating to some of the Russian concerns around their concerns over incorrect or lax inspection of the returning empty grain ships occurring by the Turkish authorities. So since yesterday, the 20th of July, the Ministry of Defence has declared that any ships sailing to Ukrainian ports, all vessels sailing in the waters of the Black Sea to Ukrainian ports will be regarded as potential carriers of military cargo, and accordingly the countries of such vessels will be considered to be involved in the Ukrainian conflict on the side of the Kiev regime. So this statement, again, not targeted at Kiev and Ukraine, really this is targeted at those nations who hold the ships, the tankers, who might be sent to Ukraine. I think they've now been very clearly warned that if they were to send their boats into this area, then they would be under the threat of Russian attack. And insurers would now not be insuring those vessels to travel and make those journeys. The grain deal, that, as I said, it was announced in July of last year and was meant to run for 120 days. Now, Putin was recently interviewed about the grain deal and had some comments about that. He said that one of the challenges that they have had is that Russian fertilizer has been actively stopped from reaching other nations. So while the Russians have been trying to move fertilizer out, the main nitrogen fertilizer pipeline from Russia was destroyed as it passes through Ukraine in Kharkiv a month or 5 weeks ago. The withdrawal of sanctions on Russian exports of grain and fertilizer to world markets has not been completed. So when this conflict started and has continued through to about I think maybe perhaps the 8th or 9th round of sanctions from the US and the West, sanctions were placed upon Russia being able to sell its fertilizer or grain to nations. Now, part of the grain deal was that those sanctions would be lifted to allow that grain and fertilizer to reach nations that need it. Putin is indicating here that that was not honoured and that those sanctions were not withdrawn. He goes on to say that Russia has even been hindered from donating Russian fertilizer to the poorest countries. And in a comment which I saw also repeated by his spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, Putin says that Russia will replace Ukrainian grain in the food market, both commercially and free of charge. So, I mean, I doubt that Russia will get the opportunity to do that. I doubt that they will be allowed to do that. I think the West will now be putting more pressure on trying to restrict the purchase in the West of Russian grain. However, with Ukraine suffering under this conflict, its production of grain and wheat has declined in the last year, and there have been reports that this planting season has been heavily disrupted, so that next year any outputs are expected to be dramatically decreased. The bulk of the grain that appears to have been exported out of Ukraine in the last year has been not, as you might expect, to developing nations, but has been to the European nations, is where a large percentage of it has gone. And so any revenue that Ukraine has been making from those grain exports will now decrease significantly, not only because of the inability to ship them through the Black Sea, but also a reduction in what they will be able to harvest next year and sell into Europe. There was some talk from Ukraine promising to provide insurance guarantees to companies who would send their ships to Ukraine. This, many people have thought, is really just perhaps a thinly veiled attempt to lure ships into the Black Sea towards Ukraine to cause a reaction from Russia, cause Russia to strike one of these effectively civilian ships, and to use that as a reason to involve NATO in the dispute. And so Ukraine looking for a way to get additional support from the West. It has been quite clear from statements made by both Turkey and the US now that they are not interested in escalating a naval dispute in the Black Sea over these grain shipments. However, there is a lot in the Western media of claiming from Secretary Blinken, the Secretary of State in America, and many others, the US ambassador to Ukraine, that Russia is using this blockade and this withdrawal from the grain deal as a terror weapon, or using food as a weapon against the poorer nations. I think that's to be expected. Expected in a conflict like this, that Western media voices would say that would be the position they would take on this. I think when you look at the detail of it, much like the start of this conflict, where in the West they call it a completely unprovoked attack by Russia, I think if you look at what has happened both there and with this grain deal, you can see that there are reasons for the Russians wishing to not extend the grain deal further. They have also mentioned many times that they're willing to consider opening up the grain deal again, but that they would need rock solid proof that the requirements are being met, things such as sanctions being lifted on them being able to move their grain and fertilizer into other countries, insurance being provided to the Russian ships. So the things that they have claimed has not been happening. Interestingly, today, Ukraine now seems to have changed its position on offering insurance guarantees and has now said that it will treat any ships travelling through the Black Sea to Russia as a military adversary of Ukraine. So effectively mimicking what Russia has said. And this is really then thought to be a tit for tat, an attempt to throttle Russia being able to leverage the Black Sea. Effectively, Ukraine saying to ship suppliers and transporters that, look, if you try to send your boats to Russia, we will treat them as being enemies of us, supporting Russia, our enemy in this conflict, and we may attack them. Now, whether or not Ukraine would actually do that and attack one of those ships, it may be a moot point, because tankers, ships, cargo ships are large, expensive pieces of equipment. People don't want to lose them and they don't want to risk them, so they will most likely look for other markets. However, Russia may use some of their own ships, and they may provide protection for those ships themselves with the Black Sea fleet, so may still be able to continue to operate through the Black Sea port. It will be interesting to see if there's any, if that were to occur, if there was any challenges made by Turkey in terms of gaining access through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. Just moving a little bit from Odessa, just talking about Wagner for a little bit. Wagner and Belarus. Now, Simplicius the Thinker has done another fantastic article and talks in this one a little bit about some of the reasons perhaps for the positioning of the Wagner forces in Belarus. We've seen a week or so ago some footage where it appears as though the Wagner forces are perhaps training some Belarusian forces. Obviously, the Wagner forces would be well positioned to train. They've had frontline combat experience for the last year. So they're training Belarusian forces. Simplicius is suggesting that Wagner may actually be being sent to Belarus and positioned to be able to defend what's known as the Suwalki corridor, and ultimately to defend Kaliningrad. Now, the Kaliningrad is an oblast of Russia which has been separated from Russia. It's separated by about 65 kilometers from the most western point of Belarus. So from on the most western corner of Belarus, you have Poland in the south, Lithuania on the north, and the Lithuanian-Polish borders join to form this 65-kilometer Suwalki gap. And on the end of that 65-kilometer gap is the eastern side of Kaliningrad. So Kaliningrad was under German control, and then 1st of August 1945, the city of Kaliningrad became part of the Soviet Union and was then renamed to Kaliningrad in 1946. Sorry, 1945 it was still called Königsberg, and then it was renamed to Kaliningrad in 1946. It was the Kaliningrad Oblast wasn't it's an exclave of the Russian Soviet Federal Socialist Republic, but with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, it became separated from the rest of Russia by independent countries, and it now remains as Russia's only all year round ice-free port on the Baltic. So Kaliningrad has access to the Baltic Sea, which gives Russia a safe haven where it can dock its ships in the Baltic, and being an ice-free port as well, it means that can occur year-round. There's a population of about 1 million people in Kaliningrad. And of those million people, the ethnicity of them is approaching 90% ethnic Russians. They did have at the start of this conflict about 12,000 army and airborne forces stationed in Kaliningrad. I'm not sure what number they have now, if that's gone up or down with the conflict, but obviously they are surrounded by Lithuania, Poland, and other NATO nations. Russia obviously will feel risk over Kaliningrad, and so talk is that perhaps the Wagner forces are headed north up there to be able to secure a corridor perhaps to Kaliningrad if required. As we say, it's a 65-kilometre line along the Lithuanian-Polish borders. Perhaps that's what they are being sent there and prepared to do. However, if they are not there to do that, then they may well be preparing to get involved in the intensifying preparations for what appears to be a new front forming in the north of Ukraine, running really from the Chernihiv region down through Sumy, which is there to the east of Kiev. Chernihiv is about 110 kilometers to the northeast of Kiev, and Sumy is about 300 kilometers sort of directly east. The Chernihiv and Sumy are very close to the Russian border. Sumy close to the Belgorod region, where Ukrainian forces have been making incursions into the Russian territory, into Belgorod, even held the township of Belgorod for a while. Up north of that, towards the Chernihiv area, is the Bryansk region of Russia. Now, only about 10 days ago, there were in these areas drone attacks attempted on Russian nuclear power plants. Small-scale attacks, but nevertheless what appear to be Ukrainian-launched attacks against nuclear power plants. In both cases, no damage was done to the power plants, but this is the region we're talking about. This is the area where the Ukrainian Deputy Secretary of Defense came out and stated that the Ukrainians believe the Russians are amassing a force of 100,000 troops up in this area, up towards Sumy and south of Sumy and toward around Kupiansk, and perhaps planning to make a push across to Kharkiv region. Allegedly, from the Ukrainian reporting, there are 900 Russian tanks, 377, I think it was, or 370 artillery pieces there as well. So if that is true, it is a large force which is being amassed up there. There have been also, just earlier this evening, missile strikes reported on Chernihiv. Sumy has had missile strikes in the last couple of days. And the strikes in those two towns have been something that have been occurring even since about May of this year. So for a few months, there has been some periodic strikes in these areas. I get the impression that Russia see them as key townships to be taken if they are to push across all the way to the Dnieper and effectively push all the way to Kiev in the north. So these attacks appear to have been to perform some sort of softening up, or perhaps identification of air defense around Chernihiv and Sumy, allowing the Russians to, once that's identified, then target that air defense, so that if a push is then made into those regions, their aircraft, their attack helicopters, and other missiles are able to then operate unimpeded by the air defense in those areas. The Russian telegram channels today are talking about Ukrainian reinforcements arriving up in the Sumy region, and that they are noticing a lot of Polish SIM card subscribers. So here I'm assuming, not understanding exactly what they mean here, but assuming that they are able to monitor mobile networks in the area and are picking out SIM card identifying numbers on mobile phones. Now, different countries, different areas in different countries do have different sequences of numbers. So just like you have different area codes or international dialing codes, these prefixes will exist on these SIM cards, I imagine, and that's allowing the Russians to determine that they're seeing a lot of Polish subscribers in the Sumy region, which they are imagining are a number of Polish mercenaries. There has in the northern regions, and not only in the northern regions, but in the northern regions, for some time been Russian reports of large numbers of Polish mercenaries fighting. In some areas, there are reports that almost all of the chatter the Russians were picking up on radios from the Ukrainian positions in some places appeared to all be Polish speaking. Certainly the Polish nation is not friendly with Russia and seems in some cases very eager to lend more support to Ukraine in this conflict. So it's not surprising that in the north there we're seeing Polish mercenaries on the ground. The Kupiansk region, which is about 80 kilometers east of Kharkiv on the Oskil River, which is not far from Kharkiv at all, is an area of intense fighting at the moment. And an area where in this Kupiansk and Krasny, just south of that Krasny Liman area, reports of Russian advances being made along the lines there. Still very heavy fighting. Lots of areas where there is the give and take, which we've seen, which is so emblematic of this Ukrainian offensive, where we will see small townships on the front line or within the grey zone be claimed by the Ukrainians in the morning and then claimed by the Russians in the afternoon and then the Ukrainians the next day. These counter battles back and forth don't seem to be making a great deal of ground for either in many cases. However, in the last week or so, there certainly have been some reports in the northern areas as one of them, where it appears as though the Russian forces are actually making and claiming and capturing and retaining some of that ground that they are making. So these announcements from the Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister that they believe the Russians are amassing a massive 100,000 man force with 900 tanks in this northern region. If true, then we might expect to see more of this heavy fighting in this area, and this will be a problem for Ukraine, as already their reports are that force reinforcements are being sent up from other areas. So if the Ukrainians are forced to fight in the north, that will then draw resources from the south, and that leaves areas like Odessa now becoming open to attack. Now, just a little bit around Odessa. Some other news today that I saw is that Moldova has suspended its membership in the Commonwealth of Independent States. This is a collection of trading nations, which about 7 or 8 nations involves Moldova, other nations, and did involve Russia. Now, the Moldovan president, Mayaki, who is pro-EU, has said that the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States, is a meaningless structure and gives no benefits to Moldova. Moldova also has close ties to NATO. It's not a NATO member. It has a neutrality policy within its constitution, which means that it can't fully join NATO because it couldn't then join NATO in let's say, an Article 5 scenario where all of those nations needed to support militarily one of their other NATO states. However, they did in 1992 join the North Atlantic Cooperation Council. So the Moldova, pro-Western EU, NATO sort of aligned state. However, in the east of Moldova, so sandwiched between Moldova proper and Odessa, is Transnistria. So Transnistria is a separatist state, a breakaway part of Moldova. And it is predominantly ethnically Russian. So it's about 30%, it's about 30% ethnic Russians. There's only about 470,000 people in Transnistria, which means about 140,000 of those are ethnic Russians. Next is ethnic Ukrainians, and then I think Romanians. I think it might be Romanians who are the third largest ethnic group within Transnistria. Transnistria declared its independence from Moldova in 1990 as the Soviet Union broke up. There was a short border war and a ceasefire in 1992. So while it's not formally recognised by around the world as a separate state, it appears to have a de facto independence within Moldova. So again, similar to Kaliningrad, where there are ethnic Russians and some Russian forces separate from Russia. In Transnistria, there's a smaller number. There's about 1,700 Russian peacekeepers who are in Transnistria. Interestingly, in March of this year, the leader of the breakaway party, the separatist party, who are pro-Russian, the Obnovlenie party, that's Vadim Krasnoelsky. His security forces in Moldova indicated they thwarted an assassination attempt on him. Just yesterday, the Communist Party leader Oleg Kozan, so this is in opposition to Vadim Krasnoelsky, who's the leader of the Transnistria breakaway separatist state at this stage. Communist Party leader Oleg Kozan was murdered in his home, allegedly stabbed to death and beaten to death in his home. It's just an interesting news topic that I saw, as I think that Odessa and Transnistria will start to become more prevalent in the news and reporting in the coming months. I can't see that Russia will want to leave Odessa as Ukrainian. I imagine that the plan will be to take Odessa, which will mean that Transnistria will then become bordering and perhaps, depending on whether Transnistria wishes to have independence or become part of the Russian Federation of States, if it will then join Russia. It's to be seen, but I do believe that the Russian plans in this special military operation have now changed, and that claiming Odessa as part of Russia will be part of that plan. An interesting report from William Burns, the CIA director. So he has been reported as saying that the key to the Ukrainian offensive may be disorder among the political and military leadership of the Russian Federation. He's suggesting that their intelligence is reporting that there's very low morale throughout the Russian military, bad command, and for those reasons he is very optimistic of the Ukrainian offensive. This is contrast with the news which has just come out today of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky firing his ambassador to the UK. This was done following a television interview where the ambassador Vadim Pristyayko made comments accusing Zelensky of unhealthy sarcasm in Zelensky's comments towards the British government minister, Ben Wallace. Now, Ben Wallace had at the NATO summit chastised Zelensky, saying that Ukraine should be more grateful for the aid that they receive from NATO and the West. Zelensky had then made comments about Ben Wallace, and apparently Zelensky was then later pulled aside and told to tone it down. Apparently now his ambassador to the UK has sided somewhat with the UK on this topic and has been fired. So when we think about that, when you think about the recent Washington Post interviews with General Zaluzhny, the commander of the Ukrainian forces, where he has openly said that while NATO and the US have forced Ukraine into an offensive without air superiority, without adequate ammunition, without adequate artillery, that they shouldn't expect the Ukrainians to be performing well here and shouldn't be forcing them into that. So conflicts there within the military. Zaluzhny has also reportedly said multiple times to Zelensky that the offensive should be stopped, that it's not going to make the goals it's meant to achieve. So with those sort of things, I wonder if the political order actually lies not within the Russian political and military command at the moment, but rather within the Ukrainian military and political command. However, just couple of other topics. Germany's aid package. So Germany has announced an aid package, and I think that this is a troubling sign for Ukraine. While at the start of June, in the first week of June, when the offensive had begun, and we had seen the losses of the Leopard 2 tanks in the minefields up north of Oryx region in Ukraine. An announcement was made at that stage by the German defense minister that Germany would provide 100 Leopard tanks. Now, in this aid package that's been announced, Germany is going to provide 10 Leopard tanks. These are Leopard 1A5, 1 tanks, not Leopard 2s, the more modern ones. And perhaps more telling, and must be very disappointing for the Ukrainians, the Germans have managed to provide them with 155mm shells. Now, there is a shortage of 155mm shells in the West. The West is struggling. Joe Biden and Anthony Blinken have both admitted there is a shortage. Germany have managed to provide 1,035 of these shells. Now, I believe that this number is correct and not a typo. That's not 100,000, that's 1,035. Now, if that is the true number, that is an indication of just how low the West is on 155mm shells. 1,000 shells at some of the current rates would last for about 4 hours at Ukraine's current rate of firing of these shells. And then the last thing mentioned in the aid package is that while they're only providing 1,035 155mm shells, they are providing 100,000 first aid kits. So this is not a positive looking or sounding aid package. What it is alluding to is that, if I read between the lines, that the lack of tanks and the lack of shells is going to lead to a lot of losses for the Ukrainians. One last thing, I think, maybe one or two last things, but one main last thing. There's a television report from Russia of a retired General Buzinski, indicating that the reprisal attacks we've seen on Odessa over the last 4 nights are not reprisal attacks for the Crimean Bridge, the Kerch Bridge attack, which many people had thought was the case because they've occurred just after the Kerch attack. However, he's indicated that these were planned sometime in advance and had been planned to coincide with the completion of the grain deal. Alexander Mercouris spoke about this yesterday, that these were complex attacks, not just done off the cuff, and would have been planned for some time, which does make sense. And that the Russians would have already have planned that once the grain deal was stopped, once they had stopped it, they knew the desires of the West for it to continue, and that it would be likely that they would need to neutralize Odessa as a grain handling port. which he further went on to. General Brzezinski went on to hint that the reprisal attacks for the Crimean Kerch Bridge attack have not happened yet. So who knows if that will happen there. One other thing is a couple of interesting things to do with technology. So while the West announced sanction packages as soon as the conflict started, and the aim there was to stop Russia from being able to produce military equipment because of its dependence upon the West. As I've reported a few weeks ago, there has actually been an increase in chips sent from the major chip manufacturing plants in the West to Russia in 2022. A lot of them done through proxy companies and that sort of thing. But overall, they believe the number has actually grown. Putting that aside, though, the Russian Institute of Applied Physics, which is part of the Russian Academy of Sciences, is developing or has developed capability to now create nanometer scale microchips. And this is down at the level of 7 nanometers, is what's being reported. So they are expecting to have a working, commercially operating machine in 2024 and continuing development from then. This, in a separate development, is sort of supported. There is a new plant in the Moscow region, microelectronics plant being developed, which will produce mobile radio equipment for mobile phones, that sort of thing, data storage services. Development on that began in December 2021, and it's now commercially operating, and part 2 will complete in November, and then that plant will be fully operational. So while the Western intention may have been to throttle Russian military missile and weapon development because of a lack of microelectronics, it appears though the Russians have been able to get through and are now developing their own high-tech capabilities within country, removing their dependence on the West, on Taiwan, and setting themselves up to sort of independently be able to do this in the future. Look, that's about it for tonight. I was unable to do a show yesterday. I will hope to go out tomorrow. If you've made it this far, hey, thank you very much for watching or listening. If you haven't subscribed already, please click the subscribe button. It does help with growing the channel, or give it a like. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.